I remember the sting of his words as clearly as the bite of winter air in my lungs. You don't own a drop of this wine anymore. He said it with the smug ease of a man who believed he had already won. My cousin Lorenzo raised the glass to the light, watching the ruby liquid catch the evening sun, as if admiring a prize plucked from my hands. It wasn't just wine to him, it was triumph, and I was meant to watch. I stood there in silence, letting his words settle like sediment at the bottom of an old barrel. My silence, as always, was mistaken for weakness. That was their first mistake, though. They didn't know it yet. The vineyard stretched behind him, rows of vines I had pruned in the biting winds of January, tied in the mud of March, blessed under the scorching heat of August. My back carried those vines. My hands bore the scars of their thorns. I remember nights when storms threatened to flatten them, when I stood alone with lantern and rope saving branches as if saving children. But when the papers were drawn, when the signatures were inked, my name was gone. I wasn't invited to the meeting. They called it a family decision, though the family they spoke of no longer included me. One signature from an uncle, another from a lawyer, and suddenly decades of labor were declared worthless. I was left with nothing but the taste of bitterness on my tongue, bitter as the first pressing of unripe grapes. But bitterness, if aged well, becomes something else. That day I said nothing. I only nodded, once turned my gaze to the hills and left them to their celebration. The laughter behind me was sharp like broken glass on stone. But I walked steadily, my hands folded behind my back, my face giving them no satisfaction of anger. Inside, I measured every word they had spoken, every look they had exchanged. I have always measured. The barrel stood in the cooper's yard, 2 towns overlined like soldiers awaiting command. Fresh oak, some chestnut iron hoops clamped tight. I knew the cooper well. His father had been my drinking companion in younger days. I also knew something my cousins hadn't thought through. Without barrels, there was no wine to sell, only juice waiting to rot. They hadn't bothered with such details. They never had. To them, the vineyard was romance and profit. To me, it was soil, sweat, patience, and memory. So I bought the barrels. Quietly through an old account under a name they would not notice. Every season they came to fill them, every harvest they depended on me without ever knowing the hands they had tried to erase still held the foundation of their fortune. I remember the smell of that cooper's yard oak shavings resin, the faint smoke of a forge. It smelled of beginnings. I remember running my hand across the smooth curve of a barrel, tapping the wood with my knuckle, and hearing the hollow echo that promised wealth to come. I thought of how my cousins would soon pour their harvest into this silence, never realizing whose silence it truly was. And so I waited. That is all. Revenge truly is patience turned into power. The season of betrayal had passed, but the season of silence had only begun. The barrels arrived in silence just as I had intended. No announcement, no ceremony, only the dull thud of wagon wheels on the cobbled road as the cooper's men rolled them into the yard. I stood aside watching the procession like a priest overseeing a quiet ritual. Each barrel gleamed with promised iron hoops biting into the pale wood, sealed tight to hold what would one day bring wealth or ruin. My cousins did not notice. They never asked where the barrels came from. To them, barrels were as inevitable as the sun rising over the vines. Grapes would ripen, presses would crush, and barrels would be waiting. They assumed the world worked that way because men like me had always ensured it. But now the world bent differently. I remember the first harvest after they had erased my name. The air smelled of fermenting skins, sharp and alive. Workers shouted, carrying baskets heavier than their own chests, purple juice running down their arms. My cousin strutted among them, Lorenzo with his silk scarf flapping in the wind, Vittorio puffing his chest as if shouting orders made him a king. And there I was on the hill watching. No one saw me, but I saw everything. The presses creaked wood, groaning under the weight of grapes. Juice spilled flowing into troughs, funneling into barrels. Into my barrels. I imagined each drop carrying my silence soaking into the wood, locked away until the day I would open it again. I should tell you, silence is not absence. It is presence restrained. Every smile I withheld, every word I kept behind my teeth, every hour I let pass without protest, all of it built a weight greater than any shouting match could hold. My cousins thought they had silenced me. They didn't understand that silence was my weapon. That year they toasted their victory with wine they believed was theirs alone. They invited merchants, politicians, lawyers. They held feasts in the great hall tables heavy with roasted lamb and wheels of cheese. Glasses clinked, laughter rose, and every tongue dripped with arrogance. I did not join them. I sat in the shadows of my own home, eating bread, crusts, and olives, sipping water. But the silence between my walls was not loneliness, it was sharpening. There are things a vineyard teaches you, things city men will never learn. Grapes cannot be rushed, storms cannot be stopped, rot cannot be undone once it sets in. But all of these can be anticipated, managed, turned to advantage. I learned long ago that control is not about strength, it is about timing. And so I waited watching them grow comfortable. They poured their efforts into parties, into titles, into appearances. But barrels are not free and barrels do not last forever. Wood leaks, hoops, loosened oak taints if mishandled. My cousins never learned these things. They had me once to worry over such matters, and without me they were blind. But I was not blind. I kept accounts. Quiet ones. I knew every barrel that left the cooper's yard, every wagon that rolled to their vineyard, every cask that made its way into their cellars. They thought they had stripped me of inheritance, but all they had done was trade soil for wood vines, for silence, and the wood was mine. I can still see the look on Lorenzo's face the day the first leak ruined a shipment. He stormed into the cooper's shop, voice raised, threatening lawsuits and reputations. The cooper, an honest man, simply pointed to the ledger signed, paid, and supplied under another name, my name. Though Lorenzo didn't know it, he had already been speaking to me. I imagine the taste of that loss lingered on his tongue longer than any wine. Do not misunderstand, I took no joy in watching barrels rot or shipments fail. That would be too small, too crude. No, what I wanted was patience ripened into inevitability. They needed barrels. They would always need barrels. And sooner or later, they would buy them again from me. The beauty of revenge is not in the strike, it is in the waiting. It is in watching your enemy walk willingly into your hand, thinking it is their own idea. Each season they returned. Each harvest the barrels bore their fruit. Each year they grew more dependent, though they never knew the truth. And each year I grew quieter, stronger. I still remember one winter evening, walking through the cooper's yard with lantern in hand. The snow lay heavy on the barrel's muffling sound. I ran my palm along the cold wood, felt the iron biting through my glove, and thought of spring. I thought of the vines waking the grapes, swelling the presses, groaning. I thought of wine flowing into these very barrels, into silence, into me, and I whispered, though no one could hear, "You took my vineyard, but I will take your wine." The barrels glowed under the lantern's light, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself a smile, because I knew the game had just begun. The vineyard was not born from profit. It was born from sweat prayers and patience. My father planted those vines when I was just a boy, his hands dark with soil, his back bent under the Mediterranean sun. He used to say that a vineyard was not owned by any man but borrowed from the land. You give your life to it, Matteo, and maybe it gives you wine in return. I believed him. For 60 years I believed him. When the summers burned hot, I carried buckets of water from the well, my shoulders raw from the rope. When winters turned the hills white, I wrapped burlap around tender shoots to keep the frost from killing them. My cousins, they were nowhere to be seen. They lived in town, parading themselves at banquets, shaking hands with mayors, dining on food I couldn't afford to smell. But come harvest, then they appeared. Lorenzo, with his silk gloves that never touched a vine, would stroll among the workers as if inspecting his army. Vittorio always boasting about our vineyard, though he could not tell the difference between a ripe grape and a spoiled one. I remember the way they posed for painters, holding glasses of my labor while I stood in the shadows wiping the juice of crushed skins from my brow. I endured it because I thought family was stronger than vanity. Years passed and the vineyard grew. New trellises, new rows, even a stone cellar dug into the hillside by my hands, not theirs. I gave up evenings, gave up youth, even gave up a woman I loved once. She wanted a husband who could take her traveling, not one who spent nights in a damp cellar tending barrels. I chose the vines thinking my family would one day see the sacrifice and honor it. They did not. I should have seen the signs. Documents signed without my presence, meetings forgotten. Payments delayed until I was forced to cover them from my own pocket. It's just, business cousin Lorenzo would say with that easy smile of his patting my shoulder as if I were some hired hand. Vittorio would laugh, waving his jeweled ring, promising that one day I'd thank them for their management. Management. That's what they called it. One evening after harvest, I walked into the hall to find them drinking with a lawyer. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the table littered with papers. They stopped speaking when I entered as if I were a servant who had interrupted. The lawyer smiled politely. My cousins did not. Lorenzo folded the paper, slipped it into a leather case, and poured me a glass of wine. To family, he said, raising his glass. His eyes dared me to ask what had been signed. I did not ask, because in that moment I understood. The vineyard I had bled for the land my father had entrusted to me had already been stolen. Not with violence, not with fire, but with ink. There is a cruelty in such betrayal that no blade could match. A knife in the dark is at least honest. Paper cuts deeper and it does not bleed. I went home that night and sat in silence, staring at my hands. They were rough, scarred, thick with calluses, hands made for soil, not for courts. And yet those same hands had kept our family alive through poor harvests, through storms, through years when famine stalked the countryside. Still, my cousins saw them as unworthy. But here is what they did not see. Patience carved into bone, endurance written into flesh. The vineyard had taught me something they never learned. Grapes crushed underfoot release their strength. Wood bent slowly will hold more than iron. And silence, if kept long enough, turns into something sharp. So I said nothing. I poured their toast into my mouth, let the wine sit heavy on my tongue, and I swallowed. They believed I had swallowed my pride. But what I swallowed was time. Every injustice I endured was like a seed pressed into soil. One day it would bear fruit. And I knew as I watched them smile over the lawyer's papers that the sweetest harvest had not yet come. The vineyard was never meant to be about wealth. It was meant to be about continuity, one season feeding the next one generation, planting for the one that followed. My father taught me that lesson with soil under his fingernails and a rosary always close by. He would say, "We do not own the land, Mateo. We belong to it. We are caretakers, nothing more." I believed him with a child's devotion, and as a man, I carried his truth as if it were scripture. When my cousins disappeared to cities to polish dining rooms and velvet parlors, I stayed behind with the vines. I remember mornings when frost clung to the leaves like crystal daggers, when I walked row by row, brushing the ice away with my bare hands to keep it from burning the grapes once the sun struck. I remember summers where the heat pressed so hard it stole the breath from my lungs, yet I stood in the fields with hat and water trimming, binding, shading each fragile cluster as if it were an infant. The vineyard demanded everything, and I gave it. My reward, not titles, not applause, just the quiet pride of a cellar filled with barrels breathing slowly, wine darkening into strength. I told myself that was enough. But there are costs a man does not always count when he is young. I never married. The vineyard was my wife. I never had children. The vines became my bloodline. When neighbors traveled, I stayed behind, for the vineyard does not pause for absence. There were nights I sat alone by candlelight, tallying accounts with ink-stained fingers, listening to laughter drift from the village tavern, wondering what it would be like to live for myself, not just for grapes. But every time I questioned, I returned to the vines, and their silence answered me. Then slowly the whispers began. Papers missing. Payments that should have come but did not. My cousins smiling too broadly when questioned. "Don't trouble yourself, Mateo," they would say, waving their jeweled hands. "You work too hard to worry about numbers. Leave the business to us." Business. The word tasted sour in my mouth. They knew nothing of business. They knew nothing of risk. They had not watched hail destroy a year's labor in one afternoon, nor had they begged suppliers for mercy when storms ruined half the crop. Business was their excuse to twist what they wanted into something respectable. I told myself it was temporary, that they were careless, not cruel, that family would not cut family from its own roots. But then came the day I found the deed missing. I had gone to the cellar to fetch a record, one of many, I kept neatly in a wooden chest bound with leather straps. My father had written the first of them, his script steady and strong. But when I opened it, pages were missing, torn clean out. My father's name erased as though it had never been. I carried the chest to the hall where my cousins sat drinking with the lawyer. Their laughter filled the rafters. I held up the empty bindings and asked, voice steady, "Where is it?" Lorenzo did not answer. He only leaned back, sipping his wine, smirking. Vittorio chuckled into his glass, muttering something about old records and new management. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. He looked at me with pity, not respect. That was the moment I understood. They had not forgotten me. They had decided I was unnecessary. The blood drained from my face, but I said nothing. I walked out the chest under my arm, its leather straps flapping loose like broken wings. Outside, the air was sharp with autumn chill. Leaves rustled along the ground, red and brittle, scattering under my boots. Each step echoed with the truth my family had stolen from me, not just land, but memory. That night, I sat alone, the chest open before me, staring at the empty places where my father's name once lived. My hands shook, not with rage, but with something deeper. A hollow ache that reached into my bones. You see, betrayal from a stranger wounds the skin, Betrayal from blood wounds the soul. Still, I did not storm the hall. I did not shout or curse. That was what they expected. That was what they were prepared for. Instead, I closed the chest, lashed it, and set it aside, because I understood then my silence was not defeat. It was preservation. They thought they had ended me with paper, but they had only given me time. I poured myself a small glass of the year's wine, dark young, a little too sharp. I drank slowly, tasting every note, every shadow. I let it sit on my tongue until it burned. And I whispered to the empty room, "You have taken my vineyard, but you will not take my harvest." The lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the wall. The vines outside lay still in their winter rest, and I knew with the certainty only silence can bring that the season of patience was over. The season of preparation had begun. It was not enough for them to steal. Thieves often want more than possession. They want recognition of their victory. My cousins could not simply take the vineyard. They had to parade me through the ashes of my own labor. The day of the feast is etched into my memory like a burn that never heals. It was late summer, the air heavy with the sweetness of fermenting grapes. The harvest had been good that year, one of the finest in decades. The cellars swelled with barrels, the courtyards filled with wagons, and the workers sang as they loaded baskets into the presses. I should have been there leading them. Instead, I was invited, not as master, not even as kin, but as guest. When I arrived at the hall, lanterns blazed against the twilight. Musicians played at the gate, trumpets and fiddles echoing down the road. Servants rushed to and fro, carrying platters of roasted birds, wheels of cheese, trays of figs and almonds. My cousins had spared no expense, not for the vineyard, but for their own pride. Inside the long table stretched like a king's banquet. The mayor sat at the head, flanked by merchants from the city men, whose purses swelled with gold and whose tongues dripped with promises of trade. And at the center of it all were Lorenzo and Vittorio, smiling as though they had conquered nations. When they saw me, their smiles sharpened. Matteo Lorenzo called, raising his glass high. "At last you join us. Come sit. Taste the fruits of our vineyard." The word struck harder than any blow. Our vineyard. Spoken before a hall of witnesses, as if history itself had always belonged to them. I sat at the far end of the table, the place reserved for those without importance. Servants poured wine into my cup, but none looked me in the eye. It was as if I had already been written out as invisible as smoke in the rafters. The mayor lifted his glass and toasted. "To the Rinaldi brothers whose stewardship has brought such fine wine to our tables. Brothers, stewardship." The words clawed at me. Not once was my name spoken. Not once was my labor acknowledged. I watched as my cousins soaked in applause, their faces glowing with triumph. They clinked glasses, accepted praise, promised futures. And me, I was a shadow at the edge of the firelight. At one point, a merchant leaned close to Vittorio and asked, "And the old caretaker, does he still work among the vines?" Vittorio laughed. "Matteo, oh, he's just a man who likes the soil. He was never much for business. We let him help now and then, but the vineyard has always needed stronger hands." The hall erupted in polite laughter. Stronger hands. I looked down at my own gnawed, scarred thick with the history of decades. Stronger hands had not saved vines from frost. Stronger hands had not hauled stones to build cellars. Stronger hands had not bled on the thorns of the branches I had trained with patience. My hands had done those things, mine and no other. But in that moment, none of that mattered. To them, I was erased. To the world, I was no one. I drank the wine they poured me. I let its heat spread through me, a fire that did not burn but simmered. And I smiled faintly, just enough for them to believe I had accepted their version of the truth. What they did not see was the silence hardening behind my eyes. Because betrayal is not only what is taken, it is what is declared, and they had declared me dead while I still breathed. As the music swelled and the feast roared, I excused myself. No one noticed my absence. I walked out into the vineyard, the rows of vines dark and silent under the stars. I placed my hand on one post, feeling the rough grain of the wood, the strength it lent the vines. And I whispered as if the vines could hear, "They think I am gone, but I am still here." The air smelled of grapes and earth, of promise and patience. I breathed it in, and the ache in my chest turned into something else, something colder, sharper. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling beams of my house, counting each creak of the wood as the wind passed. And with each creak, I repeated to myself, "Wait, measure, strike when the time is ripe." Because if they had made me a ghost, then I would haunt them. And ghosts, you see, do not need vineyards. They need silence. They need time. And both I had in abundance. The feast should have ended with wine and song. Instead, it ended with humiliation. After the mayor's toast, after the merchants had their fill of lamb and laughter, Lorenzo rose with the arrogance of a man who believed the world bent to his voice. He tapped his glass with a silver knife, the hall falling to silence. Friends, he began spreading his arms wide. Tonight is not only about our harvest, it is about legacy. The Rinaldi Vineyard has always been in the strongest of hands, and it shall remain so. Tonight we declare our intention to expand new fields, new barrels, new markets abroad. This is the future of our family name. The hall erupted in applause. Then he turned his head, his eyes sliding toward me at the far end of the table. And of course he said, voice dripping with mockery, "We must thank my cousin Matteo, who spent many years tending the soil." He paused, letting the words hang the laughter already stirring in the room. Truly he loved the dirt more than the wine. Without him, we might never have known how deeply a man could bury himself in mud. The hall roared. Even the mayor chuckled, though uneasily. Vittorio slapped the table, grinning like a fool. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I did not move. My cup trembled only slightly in my hand. I raised it, swallowed the wine, and set it down. "Come, Matteo Lorenzo," called the crowd's laughter still simmering. "Stand and take a bow for us. Show these men the hands of a true laborer." The words struck harder than the laughter. My hands, scarred, gnarled, proof of decades of devotion, reduced to a spectacle. Slowly I stood. The hall grew quiet again, expecting anger, a protest, a scene. But I gave them none of that. I simply held my hands up, palms outward, letting the firelight reveal every scar, every callus. "These," I said softly, "are the hands that built this vineyard." For a moment, silence. Then Lorenzo chuckled. "And yet, cousin, they hold no deed. What is a vineyard without papers, eh?" The hall erupted again, the laughter now cutting like knives. I lowered my hands, turned, and walked away. No one stopped me. No one cared. Behind me, music began again, laughter swelling louder as though my absence was a relief. Outside, the night air struck me cold. The stars glittered sharp as glass above the vineyard. I walked between the rows, my boots crunching on the dry soil, and I thought of my father. I thought of the promise I had made to him, as a boy, to keep the land alive, to guard it as he had. I had kept that promise, and my cousins had turned it into mockery. I stopped before one of the oldest vines, its twisted trunk as gnarled as my own hands. I pressed my palm against its bark rough and cold. "They think they have won," I whispered, "but they do not understand. The roots are deeper than their papers, and the harvest does not belong to them." The vine said nothing, but in its silence, I felt an answer. That night, I did not sleep. I sat at my table, a single candle burning low, its wax dripping onto the wood. I laid out the records. I still possessed ledgers, receipts, notes from suppliers. The vineyard was no longer mine, but the harvest. The harvest still flowed into barrels, barrels that passed through hands I could control. A plan faint as dawn began to take shape. I realized something important that night. They had taken my name, but they still depended on my silence. They thought I was nothing. That was my advantage. If they saw me as ghost, I would haunt them as ghost. The candle burned low, the flame trembling. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, listening to the creaks of the old wood. Each creak was a reminder, patience, timing, inevitability. My cousins had celebrated my erasure in public. That was fine, because one day the public would see something else, that their triumph had been built on the barrels of a man they mocked. And I swore as the candle sputtered out that when that day came, their laughter would taste like ash. Revenge does not begin with fire. It begins with wood. After the night of the feast, after the laughter of my cousins had echoed long into my bones, I returned to the cooper's yard. The barrels stood in neat rows, pale oak, bound by iron hoops, waiting for purpose. They smelled of resin, of charred insides of beginnings. To most, they were only vessels. To me, they were leverage. The cooper, an old friend of my father's, greeted me with tired eyes and resin-stained hands. He had known me since I was a boy, chasing chickens through his yard. He poured us both a measure of rough brandy, and in the silence between us, I laid out my plan. Not in words sharp with anger, but in words steady as stone. "I will take the barrels," I said. "All of them." He studied me, his brow furrowed. "It will cost you, Matteo, I know. And your cousins, they will not know." He nodded once understanding. Men like him knew the value of silence, and so the deal was struck. That year, as the harvest came heavy and rich, my cousins searched for barrels. They found them waiting, as always, never asking who stood behind the supply. They signed papers, sent wagons, filled casks to the brim. They laughed, drank, toasted their foresight, and all the while the ink on those receipts bore only my shadow. I watched from a distance as the vineyard bustled with activity. The presses groaned, the workers shouted, and the air filled with the smell of crushed skins. Grapes bled into must seeped into barrels. Their barrels. My barrels. It was a quiet sort of power, the kind most men overlook. You see, the vineyard makes the grapes, but barrels make the wine. Without oak, wine is nothing but juice. And oak was mine. I kept my movements invisible. No fanfare, no confrontation. Just contracts signed in back rooms, payments exchanged in coin and silence. I expanded my hold not just in our village, but in neighboring towns. Every cooper who valued steady business found my hand at the other end. Slowly, quietly, I became the unseen master of every barrel worth using. And my cousins, they remained blind. One evening, I stood on a hill overlooking the vineyard. Lanterns glowed in the distance, wagons rolled into the yard, barrels stacked high in the cellars. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint echo of their revelry. Then I whispered into the night, drink, laugh, celebrate. You pour your fortunes into my silence. It was almost poetic. The more they toasted their victory, the deeper they sank into my net. I began to see their weakness, not in the vineyard, but in their arrogance. They believed control came from paper, from signatures, from titles written in ledgers. They did not understand that true control rests in necessity. They could erase my name, but they could not erase their dependence. And dependence, once recognized, becomes a chain. I tightened that chain one link at a time. Prices rose subtly, season by season. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to carve deeper into their profits. Other merchants began to whisper of shortages, of delays of supply locked behind unseen walls. My cousins argued with suppliers, shouted at workers, blamed storms, blamed fate. But never once did they look toward me. That was their mistake. One afternoon, I walked through the cooper's yard as wagons rumbled out barrels bound for the Rinaldi vineyard. I trailed my fingers along the smooth wood, listening to the hollow thud of my knuckles against the staves. Each sound was a reminder, this is where their future rests. In silence, in oak in me. I thought of my father then, of his words about caretakers and land. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps we do not own vineyards. But that day I realized something else. Men do not need vines to own wine. Sometimes owning the vessel is enough. And so I let them drink, let them boast, let them imagine themselves kings of the harvest. All the while the crown sat quietly in my hands, not of soil but of wood. Because revenge does not roar. It breathes, slowly, patiently, until one day it fills every glass. The first sign of their weakness came not in their faces, but in their voices. I overheard it one morning at the market. Two merchants spoke in hushed tones over a cart of figs. The Rinaldi brothers are late again, one said. With shipments, the other asked. With everything. They promise wine, but the barrels do not arrive. They say storms delayed them. I say it is poor management. I walked past without turning my head, but inside I smiled. The delays were not storms. They were me. I had begun to slow the flow. Not abruptly abrupt moves raised suspicion. No, I let it happen gradually, like drought creeping into soil. A few barrels late this season. A shipment short the next. Always enough to explain away, never enough to confirm. And each time the Rinaldas grew more desperate. I imagined their dinners once filled with laughter, now sour with arguments. Lorenzo pacing, blaming the workers. Vittorio shouting at the merchants, swearing more barrels were on their way. Their wives perhaps glancing at each other, whispering about thinning purses. I saw it in their clothes. Fewer silk scarves for Lorenzo. No new rings for Vittorio. Small signs perhaps invisible to others, but not to me. The cooperies, meanwhile, flourished. My contracts spread like roots under the soil. Town after town, cooper after cooper, they signed with me. Not because I was generous, but because I was steady. And steadiness is worth more than silver when men depend on barrels to carry their fortunes. Soon I held the strings of supply, not just here, but across the region. And my cousins, blind as ever, were tangled in the net. They tried to compensate, of course. They boasted louder, entertained, more through feasts with food they could barely afford. But I heard the whispers in the taverns. The Rinaldes are struggling. Their shipments are light. They cannot keep their word. Whispers spread faster than frost. And frost, once it touches, lingers. One evening I stood outside the tavern door, listening to laughter spill into the street. Merchants mocked the Rinaldes openly, now imitating their pompous gestures, their promises. I did not laugh, but I let their words soak into me, like rain into dry earth. Every word was proof the plan was working. At home, I kept my silence. I ate my bread, my olives, my small meals by the fire. I poured myself one glass of wine each night, letting it rest in my mouth, tasting its weight. Their wine, my barrels. The irony was as sharp as steel. Still, I did not rush. Revenge is like wine, it spoils if hurried. It must be aged, tended, guarded. Every silence, every whisper, every missed coin in their purse was another season in the cask. Then came the day Vittorio himself knocked on the cooper's door. I watched from the shadows of the yard. He shouted at the men, demanded to know why his orders were late. The cooper, faithful, as always, shrugged and pointed to ledgers. Orders placed but supply thin. Nothing to be done. Vittorio stormed away, his face red with fury. He did not know the truth, that behind every ledger, every wagon, every barrel, my hand rested quietly. And I thought as I watched him disappear down the street, you still drink to your victories, cousin. But every drop you taste is poured from my silence. The barrels in the yard gleamed in the late sun, rows upon rows stretching like soldiers awaiting command. I laid my palm on one, the wood cool beneath my skin. Soon I whispered, because I knew the first cracks in their facade had appeared. And once cracks form, no wall, no vineyard, no fortune, no family can hold forever. The first real crack did not come from the vineyard. It came from the bank. I was in the square one morning buying flour from a miller when I saw Vittorio striding across the stones, his fine boots caked with dust. He was speaking too loudly, trying to drown the quiet, but the silence around him spoke louder than words. Two men from the bank walked beside him, their ledgers clutched like weapons. No, you don't understand, Vittorio barked. The harvest was lighter, yes, but the next will be stronger. We just need a little more time, a little more. The banker cut him off with a flat voice. Time does not ferment into profit, Signor Rinaldi. The square was busy, but I swear every ear leaned closer. Even the miller's hand stilled on his sacks. Vittorio's face burned red as he tried to wave it off, but the damage was done. The whispers spread before he had even crossed the fountain. The Rinaldis were in debt. Debt like rot creeps quickly once it takes root. Soon after, I noticed fewer wagons leaving their yard. Merchants grumbled of delays. Some stopped ordering altogether. Others demanded lower prices, their voices dripping with pity disguised as business. I kept walking, kept silent, but I watched it all. Their barrels still filled, their presses still grown, but the wine no longer left as swiftly. It lingered, unsold a harvest, growing stale in cellars too dark, too damp. At the tavern, the laughter had changed. Where once men toasted the Rinaldis' success, now they joked about their losses. One merchant mimicked Lorenzo's pompous strut, another imitated Vittorio's booming voice. The room roared with amusement. I sat in the corner, my glass in hand, saying nothing. But inside, I tasted something sweeter than wine. One evening, I heard their quarrel spill from the hall as I passed by. You spent too much on the feast, Vittorio shouted. And you promised too many barrels, Lorenzo fired back. It was your idea to, your fault, the bank. The voices tangled bitter and sharp, echoing into the night. Servants slipped out quietly, their faces pale. Even they could sense it, the house of Rinaldi was cracking. Yet still, my cousins did not suspect. They blamed storms, workers, bad luck. Never once did they wonder who held the barrels that bound their fortunes. That was their blindness, my gift. I remember standing on the hill above the vineyard at dusk, watching the lanterns flicker below. Once those lights had filled me with pride, now they filled me with certainty. You thought you erased me, I whispered to the vines, but every step you take sinks you deeper into my silence. The grapes glowed faintly in the fading light, heavy with another season's promise. A promise my cousins no longer had the strength to keep. Because the truth was simple and brutal, without barrels their wine rotted. Without wine their debts grew, and without honor their names withered. And all three belonged quietly to me. By autumn, the cracks in their fortune had widened into chasms. I saw it first in their clothes. Lorenzo, once draped in silk scarves and fine jackets, now wore wool that frayed at the cuffs. Vittorio's rings disappeared one by one, pawned quietly to men who never gave him fair value. They still walked with puffed chests, but the shine was gone. Even arrogance when hungry begins to look like desperation. In the marketplace, whispers turned into open mockery. The mighty Rinaldis begging for credit, a baker muttered to a butcher. They promised me 3 barrels last month, another merchant said, and delivered none. Empty mouths, empty wagons. One laughed. Maybe they drank it themselves. The laughter spread, not cruel at first, but certain. A laughter that comes when men sense blood in the water. I watched from a distance, buying my bread and salt, as I always did. Quiet, unremarkable. Yet I listened to every word. The bank pressed harder. I saw their notices nailed to the door of the vineyard hall, the paper fluttering in the wind like tattered flags of surrender. Passersby stopped to read, to smirk, to shake their heads. Once that hall had been a place of pride, now it was a spectacle of shame. And at night, the quarrels grew louder. Servants whispered that Vittorio had overturned a table in rage, shouting that Lorenzo had gambled away their last reserves. Lorenzo in turn screamed that Vittorio had promised shipments he could never fulfill. The walls of their house shook with curses. Neighbors heard, neighbors spoke. Did you hear the Rinaldi's fight again? They'll lose the vineyard before winter. They should never have pushed out Matteo. That last line came to me on a cold evening, drifting from two old men sitting by the fountain. They spoke it softly, but the words burned brighter than any torch. They should never have pushed out Matteo. The tide of opinion was turning. For years they had erased me from every feast, every toast, every document. But now in their collapse, people remembered. They remembered who had walked the rows at dawn, who had saved vines in storm and frost, who had carried the vineyard on his shoulders when others had vanished into city halls. The silence that once erased me now began to speak. I did not gloat, I did not taunt. That was not my way. Instead, I poured myself one glass of wine each night, the same ritual I had kept for decades. I lifted it in the dim glow of my lamp and whispered, "Drink, cousins. Drink while you can, for every drop is mine." Meanwhile, the barrels continued to flow, but not always to them. Other vineyards, wiser and steadier, paid well and on time. Their cellars swelled, their reputations grew. The Rinaldis fell while their rivals rose, supported quietly by my hand. It was almost too easy, and yet I never hurried. I let the collapse stretch like a slow winter creeping over the land. Every missed payment, every broken promise, every whisper in the marketplace added weight to their downfall, until finally the laughter was no longer hidden. Children in the square sang mocking rhymes about the Rinaldis. Men in taverns clinked glasses not to their name but against it. And through it all, my cousins kept drinking the wine stored in barrels they never knew were mine. That I thought was fitting. To be ruined not by fire or blade, but by their own ignorance. To lift glasses in triumph, never realizing the taste of their defeat lay on their tongues with every sip. The downfall had begun, and the end was near. The end did not arrive with thunder, it arrived with silence. One winter morning, I walked into the square and saw a small crowd gathered at the fountain. Sheets of paper flapped in the cold wind, nailed to the public board. I stepped closer. Foreclosure. The word was sharp as broken glass. The bank had seized the Rinaldi vineyard. Their debts had grown too heavy, their promises too hollow. What had been taken from me with ink had now been taken from them with the same. The crowd murmured. Some shook their heads, others smirked. The Rinaldis are finished, someone said. Perhaps it is justice. Another replied, perhaps it is patience. I did not speak. I only turned and walked away. That night I poured myself a glass of their wine, though by now it was also mine. I held it to the light of the fire, watching its deep red glow. How many years had I labored for this? Not for the drink itself, but for the silence within it. For the proof that time, like oak, shapes everything it touches. My cousins vanished from feasts, from markets, from the eyes of men. Where once they stood proud, they now lingered in corners, whispering to creditors, begging for favors. Their voices, once sharp with arrogance, grew hoarse with pleading. And me, I remained as I had always been, quiet, patient, steady. Merchants began to visit my small house, not with contracts for vines, but for barrels, for shipments, for wine itself. They spoke my name with respect, not pity. Slowly, the memory of my erasure faded, replaced by the truth that the vineyard's heart had always beaten in my silence. I never raised my voice against my cousins. I never confronted them in the square, never demanded they bow their heads. I did not need to. The world had already delivered the verdict. I remember one afternoon in early spring. I stood on the hill above the vineyard, the land lying bare under pale sunlight. No workers moved among the rows, no wagons rattled down the paths. The place was hollow, abandoned, waiting for someone to care again. My cousins had lost it. The land stood free, stripped of their arrogance. I rested my hand on the old vine near the crest of the hill, the same I had touched years ago on the night they mocked me. Its bark was still rough, still alive, its roots deep in the soil. "You are still here," I whispered. And so was I. In that moment, I felt no triumph, no fire of victory. Only a calm certainty like the stillness after harvest, when the fields lie empty, but the cellars are full. My revenge was not noise. It was silence aged to perfection. And as I walked down the hill, I knew their names would fade, but mine would endure, not in ledgers, not in toasts, but in the quiet truth that patience is stronger than pride. The vineyard is quiet now. The laughter of feasts is gone, the boasting voices of my cousins silenced. What remains are the rows of vines stretching into the distance, their branches bare, but waiting as they always do for the return of spring. I walk among them in the early morning, the dew still clinging to the grass, the air carrying the faint smell of earth turning soft again. My boots press into the soil, and I feel the weight of years beneath each step. This is the land that raised me, the land they thought they could strip from me with a stroke of a pen. Yet here it stands, and here I stand. I did not burn them. I did not strike them. I did not shout my name in the square or demand they bow their heads. I simply waited. I bought the barrels they needed, sold them back, the silence they thought was theirs, and let time do what time always does, reveal the truth. Their downfall was not my doing alone. Pride is its own poison. Arrogance is its own collapse. I merely gave it the vessel in which to ferment. Now when merchants raise their glasses, they speak of my patience. When neighbors whisper, they remember who walked the rows at dawn, who saved the vines in frost, who kept the vineyard alive when others abandoned it. My cousins' names have become warnings. Mine has become memory. I drink one glass each night as I always have. I do not drink to triumph. I do not drink to spite. I drink to silence, the silence that endured longer than their noise, the silence that turned bitterness into strength. And as the wine rests on my tongue, I think of my father. We do not own the land, Mateo. We belong to it. He was right. The vineyard was never truly mine nor theirs. It belonged to time, to patience, to those who gave themselves to it without vanity. In the end, my cousins lost because they sought to own what could never belong to them. I waited. I endured. And so when people ask what became of the vineyard, I simply say, it endured too. That is enough.